Okay, welcome everyone to the second lecture in our series Cultures of the Crisis, Corona and Beyond, presented by the chair group European Culture and Literature at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. My name is Florian Lippert and I'm very happy to see, or rather read, so many of you again, and also to see many new names on our participant list. I hope everyone is doing reasonably well amidst and despite this crisis, which keeps challenging us in quite new and unprecedented ways. And indeed, these unprecedented ways are at the core of what we want to address in this lecture series. So how does the pandemic affect culture and cultures? How does it influence what we do, what we think, and how we see the world? Which impacts might it have in the long run? So, for instance, we'll be all, as the German sociologist Armin Nasehi recently stated, indeed be glad if, I quote Nasehi, this crisis is over and all the normal crises are finally back. An interesting thought, which also connects nicely to some of the research we have recently conducted at the chair group European Culture and Literature, together with colleagues from other groups, on the question, what are the normal crises in the case of Europe? In case you're interested in reading more about this huge question, I highly recommend this volume here, this special volume of the Journal of European Studies, which is actually entitled European Crisis and was edited by several colleagues from our chair group from European Culture and Literature at the University of Groningen, together with further colleagues. Most of the articles in here are open access, so freely available on the net for you to read. Simply Google Journal of European Studies, European Crisis, and you will find these highly interesting texts on this matter. But enough academic product placement for today. Last week we had a brilliant kickoff lecture by Pablo Valdivia, and James Lee, followed by a great discussion with the audience. In case you have missed this first lecture, you can watch the recording on our series website. Pardon me. Simply Google Cultures of the Crisis Groningen. We will also have a QR code later in today's session for you to scan, or of course you might be already familiar with this website since you will probably have logged in through it. But in case you haven't, simply Google Culture of the Crisis Groningen. So today it is my great pleasure to introduce my dear colleague and friend, Dr. Alberto Godioli, who is senior lecturer in our chair group and program director of the Netherlands Research School for Literary Studies, in short OSL. Alberto obtained his PhD in 2012 from the Scuola Normale Superiore of Pisa, and from 2013 to 2015 he was a Newton International Fellow at the University of Edinburgh. Alberto's research mostly focuses on humor and satire across media, with particular but not exclusive attention to literature. Currently, Alberto is developing a project on legal controversies regarding dark humor, and since January this year, he is the principal investigator of a project that is funded by the Network of European Institutes for Advanced Studies, in short, NETIAS, and which is entitled Cartoons in Court Towards a Forensic Analysis of Visual Humor. The title of Alberto's lecture today is Stranger Things, Defamiliarization in the Time of COVID-19. Alberto, great that you're with us, and we're all looking very much forward to your presentation. Please take it away.
Hi everyone, and many thanks, Florian, for your introduction. So, as you can guess from the title, I would like to discuss today the notion of defamiliarization and how it relates to the coronavirus crisis. First of all, we need to define what we mean by defamiliarization in general. So, I would like to start with a quick example that might help us with that. Some of you might already be familiar with these comic strips by Nathan Pyle called Strange Planet. They represent everyday human activities as if they were strange alien rituals that we are seeing for the first time. This, for instance, is people celebrating a birthday. That's to say, the position where the planet was when you emerged. I will give you a second to read this. So this other one instead is a strip about another ordinary human action, such as hugging and crying. That's to say, mutual limb enclosure and pouring face fluids, respectively. Again, I'll give you a second to read it. Now, these are all good examples of what we generally mean by defamiliarization. This notion was first introduced by a Russian literary theorist, Viktor Shklovsky, in 1917. The word used by Shklovsky in the original Russian was estrangement, which also translates as making strange. This is Shklovsky's definition. If we start to examine the general laws of perception, we see that as perception becomes habitual, it becomes automatic. If one remembers the sensations of holding a pen, or speaking in a foreign language, or celebrating a birthday, or hugging, we might add, for the first time, and compares that with their feeling at performing the action for the 10,000th time, they will agree with us. The purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived and not as they are known. The technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and length of perception. Art is a way of experiencing the artfulness of an object. With this last sentence, Shklovsky means that art takes something that we usually take for granted, that we consider natural, and presents it to us as something artificial, arbitrary, that could also be done in different ways. If we think about the examples we just saw about the birthdays and hugging and crying, you can easily see what we mean here. Now, if we think about it, this is exactly what COVID-19 is doing with our everyday habits and practices. It is taking everything we normally consider as natural and habitual and casting a new, alien, unfamiliar perspective on it. First of all, on a very concrete level, the virus has defamiliarized our everyday routines. If we think now about things that used to be so normal as going to a restaurant, using public transportation, or simply shaking hands, we definitely get that weird alien vibe right now. But on top of that, the virus also defamiliarizes or exposes the arbitrariness of some of our higher order societal and political habits that we normally took for granted. For instance, pursuing unsustainable growth with all its implications, pollution, deforestation, mass meat consumption, large-scale breeding of wild animals, etc. Or more generally, blindly following the neoliberal logics which brought to drastic public health cuts in many parts of the world. So these higher scale habits are also something that we used to take for granted, and that we are now forced to see from a different, unfamiliar perspective due to the virus. So in a sense, we can say that COVID-19 is also a chance for us to step back and defamiliarize us with our habits. That's to say, to think critically about things that we consider normal, unsustainable growth, neoliberal logics, etc., and to realize what is wrong with this normal state of things. In other words, to quote a meme that is widely circulated these days, defamiliarization can help us understand that we should not just go back to normal, because normal was the problem, or at least a big part of it. Now, this is something that applies to any kind of large-scale structural crisis in our lives. A crisis is always a moment of major disruption which defamiliarizes us with life as we knew it, and thereby gives us a chance to think critically about normality. Not by chance the word critical comes from crisis. So far, so good. On the other hand, though, human nature also tends to what Shklovsky used to call habitualization. That's to say, sticking to normal thought patterns as much as possible, minimizing disruption on a psychological and behavioral level, and simply trying our best to slide back into normality without really questioning what normality is and what may be wrong with that. So, habitualization is also a spontaneous human reaction to the defamiliarization that is usually brought about by major crises. Summing up in the words of economist Daniel Kahneman, habitualization belongs to the realm of fast thinking, which is automatic. Shklovsky would agree. It is based on stereotypes and it's prone to bias confirmation. Defamiliarization, instead, belongs to the sphere of slow thinking, which is more difficult and demanding for the human mind. Not by chance, slowness and length of perception is a key concept in Shklovsky of estrangement, of defamiliarization too. So it comes as no surprise that humans tend to resort to habitualization as a frequent response to crisis, as opposed to defamiliarization, simply because it's easier. Now, if we look at actual responses to the COVID-19 crisis in the media, as well as in political debates, we can see several kinds of this normalizing, habitualizing mechanism. One example, we already saw it last week with Pablo Valdivia's lecture in particular, that is to say the use of habitual and conventional metaphors, such as the war metaphor, through which we try to familiarize ourselves with a strange new reality, thereby also distorting it. Another form of normalization is clinging on old national and nationalistic stereotypes. We saw that in last week's lecture with Judith Jansma in particular. And we have seen so many of these stereotypes in many different forms over the last couple of months. The idea, for example, that our country is cleaner or more efficient and therefore safer than another given country. Stereotypes clearly have a reassuring quality, precisely because of this normalizing function. They provide us with old familiar lenses to interpret a new reality that doesn't necessarily match with those old lenses. A third form of normalization is what we can call social Darwinism. That's to say the survival of the fittest mentality, whereby we shouldn't worry too much because the virus only targets the old and the weak, as if the lives of the old and the weak were not so important after all. This is also something that we've been hearing quite often, as discussed in this article by Francis Ryan, for instance. And this also works as a normalizing mechanism, which distances us from the human costs of the crisis and therefore reinforces the illusion that ultimately life can still go on as normal. Another form of Darwinism is what we could define as national Darwinism, namely the idea that stronger, richer countries should not be burdened or weighed down by poorer countries. We see that a lot in current debates regarding the North-South divide in the EU. This is also a normalizing mechanism since it momentarily allows countries that are better off to distance themselves from the problem, to locate the anomaly elsewhere, and to reinforce the idea that we can go on as usual. Lastly, and related to that, there is another kind of normalizing mechanism that I would like to discuss, which we can summarize as economy-driven arguments. The idea that the economy should come first and we should therefore go on as normal, because in the long run, the lockdown will kill more people than the virus. Now, I am not debating here whether or not an extended lockdown is the best course of action against the virus. I clearly don't have the instruments or knowledge to do that. Likewise, I am not denying that the lockdown has serious economic implications. What I am arguing instead is that it's only that this kind of economic argument, the idea that the lockdown will kill more people than the virus, is fundamentally flawed as it suffers from a normalizing bias. It distorts reality by way of forcing it into habitual schemes of thoughts that may in fact be inadequate or even cause damage. I will try to elaborate a bit more on this normalizing bias affecting the economy-driven argument. First of all, as it has been pointed out, this argument is an example of economism. That is to say, following James Kwok's definition, the misleading application of basic lessons from Economics 101, Introductory Economics, to real-world problems, creating the illusion of consensus and reducing a complex topic to a simple open and shut case. This is exactly what Shklovsky would define as habitualization. That is to say, taking an unfamiliar reality and forcing it back into familiar patterns, which is what, for instance, Trump is doing when he claims that the lockdown and the ensuing recession would kill more people than the virus. This is a simplistic and misleading argument, as it lacks the fact that without a lockdown, the virus would probably cause an even heavier recession. And again, I'm not interested in entering an economic debate here. I only want to stress how the normalizing bias stands in the way of a lucid and coherent reflection on the crisis. In addition to that, the argument we are discussing is misleading also because it omits a very important detail. The lockdown by itself does not kill people. It is the combination of lockdown and structural inequalities in terms of housing, access to healthcare and welfare, etc., that can kill people. This aspect of the normalizing bias is best described as an example of capitalist realism. Namely, according to Mark Fisher, the widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but also that it is now impossible to even imagine a coherent alternative to it. So much so, and this is a very frequently quoted sentence, that it becomes easier to imagine an end to the world than an end to capitalism, or simply a humanization of capitalism, one could add. And interestingly, this latter point, the possibility of changing capitalism, was addressed in a recent interview by French President Macron, definitely not a hardcore anti-capitalist, who nonetheless pointed out that the COVID-19 crisis could give us an opportunity to think the unthinkable, that's to say, to transform capitalism from within, so to speak. But still, the very possibility of transforming the current state of things is suffocated by capitalist realism, which predicates that there is no alternative to the normal, habitual forms of neoliberal capitalism. So to sum up, we are trying now to tease out the different kinds of normalizing bias underlying the claim that the lockdown is more deadly than the virus. First, we discussed this claim as an example of economism, then as an example of capitalist realism. Last but not least, we can also link this claim to the notion of instrumental reason. In the dialectic of enlightenment, Horkheimer and Adorno famously defined instrumental reason as the use of economic reasoning only as an instrument to a goal, for instance, growth or profit, without reasoning about the goal in itself. So this kind of economic reason becomes a way to normalize higher order habits we were mentioning at the beginning of the lecture: unsustainable growth, mass meat production, public health cuts, etc. It simply becomes impossible to imagine an alternative to what we recognize as normality. A key feature of instrumental reason, according to Horkheimer and Adorno, is that it tends to reduce everything to numbers and abstractions, thereby neglecting all the aspects of human life that cannot be quantified. This kind of abstraction is precisely what Boris Johnson was widely accused of when back in March he announced that the UK would not go into lockdown, because once again the economy is more important. Johnson's position has clearly changed a bit since then, but this is a good example of how instrumental economic thinking and the degree of abstraction that comes with it can work as a normalizing mechanism. It makes us blind to the actual human dimension of the crisis, and thereby tricks us into thinking that we can still go on with business as usual. Now, these processes of abstraction, economization, and dehumanization actually take us full circle back to Shklovsky. If we go back to Shklovsky's 1917 essay, we can see how the definition of the habitualizing process that stands opposed to defamiliarization is also a perfect description of the economy-driven arguments that we have been discussing so far. Let's read Shklovsky's extended definition here. If we start to examine the general laws of perception, we see that as perception becomes habitual, it becomes automatic. The process of algebraization, the overall of an object, permits the greatest economy of perceptive effort. Either objects are assigned only one proper feature, a number. For example, think about the several statistical reports that have been circulated in recent times in support of economy-driven claims about the coronavirus crisis. Or else they function as though by a formula and do not even appear in cognition. And so life is reckoned as nothing. This is precisely the effect of the algebraization, of the economization of the crisis, and in general of many normalizing mechanisms that we have been examining so far. They detach us from matters of life and death. They reduce the victims of the virus to numbers, and thereby they allow us to minimize the psychological disruption that is caused by the crisis and to slide back into normal modes of thinking. According to Shklovsky, the purpose of estrangement, of this process of familiarization in the arts, is precisely that of shaking us from this state of numbness and encourage us to think critically about normality. So going back to the mind map we used earlier on, we can say that artistic defamiliarization can tip the scale in favor of critical thinking, as opposed to the habitualizing tendencies that are so common in our responses to the crisis. This is also the last point of my presentation. I would like to give some examples of how cultural products can use estrangement, can use these processes of artistic defamiliarization, or more precisely, how they can embrace the defamiliarizing effects of a crisis in order to prompt a critical reflection on what we usually perceive as normality. In particular, since I work on humor in my research, I would like to stress how humor can be a powerful tool for promoting defamiliarization and critical thinking in times of crisis. I mean, humor doesn't always have this function. It can also be used as a tool to normalize or trivialize or make light of a potentially disruptive and traumatic reality. But on the other hand, certain forms of humor can use defamiliarization to remind us that something is wrong with the normal state of things. This is often the case with what we usually refer to as dark humor. Not by chance, the first classic example of dark humor in Western literature was created right in the midst of a terrible crisis. I am talking about A Modest Proposal by Jonathan Swift, which was written during the Irish famine of the 1720s. In this satirical work, Swift actually argues that the most reasonable solution to the crisis is simply eating the children. I have been assured by a very knowing American of my acquaintance in London that a young, healthy child where nursed is, at a year old, a most delicious, nourishing, and wholesome food, whether stewed, roasted, baked, or boiled. And I make no doubt that it will equally serve in a fricassee or a ragout. If we read further in the text, it becomes clear that Swift is mocking a way of thinking that was already all too familiar in the early 18th century. That is to say, the same economy-driven, instrumental attitude that we have just encountered in so many responses to the COVID-19 crisis. In other words, Swift takes something that was considered as normal already in his time, the idea that people are commodities or resources, that the economy should have priority over everything, etc., and takes it to the extreme in order to show that something is fundamentally wrong with this normal state of things. We can see how this kind of instrumental economic reasoning is the main target of Swift's satire in passages like this one. The number of souls in this kingdom being usually reckoned 1.5 million, of these I calculate there may be about 200,000 couples whose wives are breeders, from which number I subtract 30,000 couples who are able to maintain their own children. I again subtract 50,000 for those women who miscarry. There only remain 120,000 children of poor parents annually born. The question, therefore, is how this number shall be reared and provided for we can neither employ them, the children, in handicraft or agriculture, they neither build houses, I mean in the country, nor cultivate land. They can very seldom pick up a livelihood by stealing till they arrive at 6-year-old. Now, based on this economizing mentality that was already normal in the 18th century, the children of poor parents can provide for themselves and don't bring any profit to the nation, so we might as well kill them and eat them. To sum up, a modest proposal is a perfect example of defamiliarization. Swift is targeting a mode of thinking that was quite normal and familiar at the time, and it makes it unfamiliar by stretching it to the extreme and thereby showing the inherent cruelty and inhumanity of this logic. This is the very same strategy that we can find in more recent examples of dark humor in response to the COVID-19 crisis, such as these cartoons published by French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo. The one on the left portrays carpenters and factory workers going back to work straight from their ICU beds, because, as we read in the caption, growth cannot wait. Likewise, the cartoon on the right ironically suggests that the spike in deaths caused by the virus should be welcomed as a perfect solution to overpopulation. Now, just like Swift did not mean to make fun of the children of the poor Irish families, these Charlie Hebdo cartoons clearly are not mocking the victims of the virus. On the contrary, they use the shock effect of dark humor to defamiliarize us with the neoliberal logics that we normally take for granted. In short, at the beginning of this lecture, we saw how the COVID-19 crisis has a defamiliarizing effect on our lives, and how this defamiliarization can be a chance for critical reflection on what we usually perceive as normality. Then, so how critical reflection, this kind of critical reflection, is easily hampered by the various habitualizing and normalizing mechanisms underlying common responses to the crisis. For instance, conventional metaphors, stereotypes, social Darwinism, economy-driven arguments, etc. Lastly, we saw how cultural products responding to the crisis, from literature to memes, can use defamiliarization as a way to tip the scale in favor of critical reflection. We briefly discussed dark humor as an example. On a closing note, I would like to share one last remark in light of patient narrative. In the field of narrative medicine, a patient narrative is the story that is built by a patient in the process of making sense of their experience with their illness. Now, while trying to cope with the COVID-19 crisis, humanity as a whole is clearly in the process of creating its collective patient narrative about this experience. In his book, The Wounded Storyteller, Arthur Frank argued that there are basically three kinds of patient narratives. The restitution narrative, which is all about going back to normal, with the illness being only a momentary deviation from normality. Then the chaos narrative, which emphasizes the chaos and disruption caused by the illness. And lastly, the quest narrative, which represents illness as a journey in which you also learn something new about yourself. A main point today is that defamiliarization can help us overcome both the restitution narrative and the chaos narrative, and help us shape our experience into a quest narrative, at the end of which we don't just go back to normal, but also try to make our normality a bit less toxic and more humane. And I thank you very much for listening.
And here comes the first question. I read out the question. Does the, quote, quest, unquote, narrative not also run the risk of becoming a neoliberal, quote, unquote, resilience narrative? So this is about the possible transformation from the quest narrative to the resilience narrative. Alberto, would you like to respond to this?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Melanie. This is really a great question. And yeah, I mean, I fully agree. I might have referred to the quest narrative in a bit of an acritical way, as if it was necessarily a good thing or an effective way to promote critical thinking. But it's also true that narrative is just a tool, so it can be used in many different ways. And the message of the story can change depending, of course, on who is telling the story and who is on the receiving end. So if I can just nuance my argument a little bit, I would say that the quest narrative can be an instrument to indeed take a step back and not take normality for granted, but it can also become a way to reinforce normality through other means. So it's indeed an ambiguity that is there, and it just depends on indeed what kind of story, what kind of quest narrative is being built. I fully agree. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. Any further questions or comments? Oh yes, here's a very long question. Thank you very much for this application of Shklovsky's concept, which seems to be very fruitful for evaluating the cultural impact of the ongoing crisis. While your argument seems to follow in part Bertolt Brecht's adaptation of the concept of alienation, indeed, as a means of ideological critique, so the question asker in this case, was wondering if another aspect of Shklovsky's original article can be helpful here as well. By quoting an example from Tolstoy, Shklovsky shows that defamiliarization can be achieved by situating oneself in a non-human perspective. Might this be of significance in the current situation as well? Does being confronted with the non-human of the virus have a defamiliarizing effect as well? So this is a bit of a suggestion for a bit of a shift in regards to the question of the non-human of the virus. So maybe if I might add to that, if we think of the war metaphors Pablo mentioned last week and you mentioned it again this week, so well, the enemy is not quite graspable, is he then? Alberto, would you like to respond to that?
And that's such a great point. Thank you. And it is definitely something that I would have liked to further delve into, even in my presentation. But yeah, I just decided to leave that non-human aspect out just for timing reasons. Although I tried to hint at it with the cover, like the first slide of my presentation that only had a goat in it. So like the presence of the non-human there was kind of or the importance, the role of the non-human in processes of defamiliarization was just hinted at there. But that's indeed a key point, and also one that makes us reflect on the notion of the role of defamiliarization also when it comes to dealing with the climate crisis. And there's a clear link, I would say, between our common responses to the COVID-19 crisis and our common responses to indeed climate change. The same amount of normalization, denial, habitualization is clearly happening there. And I think that the role of defamiliarization there could be very important in making us see things from a different, and in this case, non-anthropocentric perspective. So I would definitely stress the link there. Thank you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. And here's the next one. Very interesting talk, thank you. Brecht's conception of defamiliarization is different in many ways from estrangement, but your argument made me wonder where the similarities lie. Do both thinkers have a stake in refreshed, slowed down perception and narration of reality, especially in the face of crisis? Do you have any thoughts on that? So that would be a question on the connection or interconnections between Brecht and Shklovsky's original conception. Alberto, any thoughts on this?
Thank you, Robert. Thanks. Yeah, that's also a very important point that I had to leave out a bit, because indeed I focused on the Shklovsky idea of estrangement, but of course, if we want to measure the cultural impact that Shklovsky had in the 20th century, we also have to deal with Brecht, of course, and the Verfremdung effect, right? I think that there might be a similarity when it comes to this notion of slowing down perception, at least if we take it from a cognitive kind of perspective. And if we go back to this kind of dichotomy that was proposed recently by Kahneman between fast thinking and slow thinking, I think it's safe to say that both in the case of Shklovsky and in the case of Brecht, alienation, defamiliarization are a way to promote slow thinking over fast thinking. But then, that being said, there are also a lot of interesting differences between the Brecht definition and the Shklovsky's definition that would definitely work for the discussion.
And of course, also with Brecht, you have maybe possibly more direct, I would add there, more direct connection to actual political, well, not to say agitation or propaganda, but say to a direct link to political messaging there, right? So it's less of a transition work, so to speak. Anyway, here comes the next interesting question. Very interesting presentation. I have one question on the part where you mentioned that the lockdown doesn't kill people, but the underlying social inequality, if this is quoted correctly, does.
Yeah.
To what extent, however, does the lockdown in many countries, I have the US in mind in particular, only worsen this underlying inequality and therewith, either in short or long term, have an adverse effect in terms of possible outcomes of defamiliarization?
Yeah.
Alberto, you're reading along?
Okay, sorry. In terms of the positive outcomes. Yeah. Thanks, Anna, for
positive. You're right. Yes.
Yeah. Indeed, that makes a lot of sense. This point that I made about the idea that the lockdown is more deadly than the virus, and the fact that this phrasing leaves out a very important point that has to do with the structural inequalities that play clearly a big role in this kind of scenario. So that point mainly has to do with a framing kind of issue, so to speak. But it is true that any change that could be kind of implemented on the structural inequalities can only come in the longer term. So in the short term, it is true that it is difficult to change things in a structural way. So as I said before, as part of my lecture, it is difficult for me to enter the technical details of the economic debate about this issue, but at the same time, I think that it is in the interest of every actor in this kind of scenario to not to be biased in their discussion of the problem, and not to leave out the role that these structural inequalities play in the situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's also a question of where to start, or how to define structural in this case, clearly, right? So do we kind of depart from the idea of the structure being there, being inevitable, as you're pointing out, or not? Surely. And I mean, of course, this is a very very contemporary question, a very urgent one, since right now on a daily basis we see these images of people protesting in different parts of the United States against the lockdown, fueled by the president, right? So we also see a core or a very, very typical example here of these new divides, these new divisions in unprecedented ways, which is also a basis of this lecture series, to see how this crisis also creates new social and cultural divides, of course. Fantastic. Next question: which role do conspiracy narratives play? Now, that's also one of your favorites, Alberto, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's also a very ambiguous point, because if we think about the way in which, like for instance, right-wing populist actors make use of conspiracy theories, they also present those as a defamiliarizing practice. So it is not just that on the one hand we have mainstream established thinking that is inherently conservative, and then we have defamiliarization that is a way to encourage critical reflection in the progressive sense. But sometimes the very same tools of defamiliarization can be used as a way to muddle the waters, so to speak, and to present something that is inherently reactionary or conservative as something that is like going going against the mainstream, and thereby assigning this kind of underdog power to the sort of theory that you are espousing or presenting. So, as we said before, with regard to narrative, we can say the same when it comes to defamiliarization. It is just a tool that can be used in many different ways from like on the part of very different kinds of let's say political forces or actors, and that I think might explain also or might be one possible answer to the question, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Alberto. And here's another question. As you mentioned, humor offers different possibilities in addition to defamiliarization, such as trivialization, etc. Reflecting on the potential of humor as a tool which can eventually reach quite different ends, does it then also provide opportunities for fostering solidarity, do you think? Is that what we see in some of the examples shown? I think this also connects to a question we discussed last week, if I remember correctly. So this would be about the connection between, or possible potential connections between your examples of humor on the crisis and solidarity.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think so. Also, in the case of humor, it's a tool that can be used in many different ways. It can have a bias confirmation sort of function, and that's a more, let's say, conservative function in a technical sense. But on the other hand, it can also help you think in different ways that you wouldn't have considered in the sphere of a serious thinking and communication. And so I definitely think that humor too can be part of this construction of narratives of care that we were already discussing last week. And it can be used as indeed as an effective instrument in this direction. There are already now very interesting studies that are in their early stages about the humor that is being produced in response to the corona crisis. And it's already very interesting to see, if you look at the memes or cartoons that have been published, that have been circulated about this topic, how diverse the field is in terms of in which direction do these kinds of humor go. Some memes, some cartoons are definitely all about making light of the crisis, making fun of the crisis, and that's part of the relief function of humor that is definitely there. And while others indeed go more into this defamiliarizing direction, meant as a way to encourage critical thinking. So yeah, there's definitely a bit of everything there. So my point was that humor and defamiliarization can be used in the direction of critical thinking, although that's not always necessarily the case. So it depends on who is using these tools and why. Yeah.
Great. So we can see, those of you who are reading along in the chat, we can see a gentle hint by Pablo Valdivia on some past occasions on which we discussed these and similar topics in the
Thanks,
OSL
Pablo.
framework. So great recommendation to anyone to check out this link here. We continue with an interesting question on another absolute buzzword these days, namely the new normal. So the question reads, thanks, Alberto. If crisis as a term suggests a temporary disruption of normality that might eventually lead to either a restoration of normality or a new different situation, what do you think may be the fate of defamiliarization as the COVID-19 crisis is gradually turning into a chronic one that is not likely to disappear or be resolved soon? Do you think the relation between this crisis and the notion of defamiliarization may shift as the crisis is turning from a temporary disruption of normality to a chronic state, or the much quoted new normal?
Yep. Thank you very much, Maria, for this question. And yeah, it ties in a lot with some of our previous conversations, like with Florian and Maria, about the notion of normality and abnormality and defamiliarization. And yeah, this notion of the chronic crisis is indeed a very interesting one, and one that begs for further reflection. And my first answer to this could be that if we go back to that mind map that we used earlier on in the lecture, with this sort of tension between defamiliarization and critical thinking on the one hand, and habitualization on the other hand, I guess we can assume that as time goes on, the defamiliarizing power of the crisis will decrease by itself, and that's where I would say cultural products reflecting on the crisis will become more and more urgent and more important in tipping the scale again in favor of critical thinking, as opposed to simply accepting life as it is. So yeah, I think that's a very important point too.
Yeah, and in connection to that chronicity or threatening chronicity, maybe an additional question. You showed this great image of this great slogan or motto, let's not go back to normal because normal was the problem, and you added, I think, or at least part of the problem. That reminded me of a common criticism we read and see lately quite frequently in the face of, for instance, the decline of pollution these days. Right, so the first time clear water in the canals of Venice for I don't know how many decades, and so on and so forth. So the references to, for instance, the climate change or climate crisis, right, and the question, how will this, or will it be, would you say that, basing on your current kind of evaluation of the situation and also the outlook towards a possibly more chronic corona crisis, how would you say could this develop in relation to these more profound crises and crisis narratives?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think this link between the corona crisis and the climate crisis is such an important and urgent one to reflect on. And I do think that one of the roles of cultural responses to this crisis is indeed that of trying to build a bridge to the climate crisis. And indeed, there is already a significant amount even of memes, to go back to memes, that already deal with this kind of relation between these two crises. And from my perspective, I don't think this can be achieved by means of these simplistic arguments whereby, oh, well, after all, the COVID crisis is good for the environment. So this kind of paradoxical claims or arguments. So the link between the two is more complex and more nuanced than that, but there is definitely one, and it is worth further reflection by means of critical thinking, by means of cultural production, etc.
Excellent. Another question. Great presentation, Alberto. I'd like to add to James' question. So that was the question we heard some time before about possible connections between humor and solidarity. So I continue reading this question. In my experience studying humor as a response to the 2008 crisis in Spain, I found that many cultural comedic works were often targeted to a younger audience and promoted solidarity by showing a collective suffering through humor, and diversion. Have you found similar trends during the current pandemic? For example, all of the memes, comics posted on Instagram and social media, etc. So this is about the target groups of humor.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Johan, for your question. And yes, it makes a lot of sense. And I think this question taps into what is often referred to as, let's say, the community building function of humor. That's something that applies to any kind of humor. Whenever you joke about something, you expect somebody to laugh, and sometimes you even expect somebody else not to laugh. That's the notion of unlaughter, no? That when you tell a joke, you also take into account that the joke that there's some people out there who will not get the joke, and this also draws a boundary between the in group and the out group. So that's a function that humor always has, and a big difference that can be made there is the one between more inclusive kinds of humor that sort of implies the message that we are all in this together, and on the other hand, exclusionary forms of humor that kind of, as we were saying before during the presentation, it kind of locates the anomaly or the incongruity elsewhere outside of the community. And it's something that this latter kind of humor, we saw it quite a lot, I think, in the early stages of the corona crisis, when it was still possible to draw national divides and boundaries when it comes to where the virus comes from and who the virus will be affecting. But the more we become aware of the fact that the virus is a global kind of issue, I would say the more difficult it becomes to produce this kind of exclusionary humor. So my hope is that humor as a response to the crisis will also become a way to build larger communities and to stress the message that we are all in this together, indeed.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fantastic. Any more questions? Yeah, here goes. Do you think that the idea of the quest narrative and/or/slash critical thinking might become mundane if an alternative, concrete vision is not presented soon enough? So what about helplessness, rise of helplessness, for instance?
Yeah, absolutely. That's also such an important point. Thanks, Oleg. And it is also a form of criticism that is sometimes leveled in the field of narrative medicine, where this notion of quest narrative comes from, against this idea of the quest narrative. So by now, it does sound a bit cliche, now, this idea that, oh, I have learned something from my trauma, I have learned something from my illness or from my crisis. No, it can really become just empty words. And it's so important there that the so-called pars destruens, so the negative part of the argument that is developed through this kind of critical thinking is also somehow complemented by a pars construens, so a more constructive part. And this is also where, of course, like the role of politics becomes so important, and our role as well, of course, as part of the public sphere. And it's good that at least this point is being increasingly debated in the media, for instance, by politicians. If you look at the way that the European Union is debating the corona crisis, there is, at least on the part of some actors there, an effort to try and think of possible concrete ways to think about our lives together in a new, unfamiliar way. So let's just hope that this defamiliarizing perspective on the situation we're in actually becomes the predominant one, as opposed to the habitualizing forces that stand on the other side.
Fantastic. Well, thank yous and compliments.
Thank you,
Keep
Florian.
popping in through. Yeah, well, I was just going to say I would simply just like to add to that and repeat them. So in the chat, there are many thank yous and compliments to you, dear Alberto. And I want to add to these, also adding to another more pragmatic compliment that we're perfect in regards to the time frame here. Thank you so much, dear Alberto. Thanks to everyone for the great discussion, for the great questions. And thank you, Pablo, for the compliments to the chair. Three brief announcements in regards to the upcoming weeks. Firstly, as announced beforehand, the recording of this lecture, hopefully more flawless, technically flawless version of this lecture, will be online very soon. So please just check our website over the next few days. Then a big thank you again to Konstantin Mirau, who once more helped out with managing participation today, so basically the muscle of the chat room, so to speak. And next week we will have a break in this lecture series, so please do join us again in 2 weeks' time, then for a great lecture by our fantastic new colleague Christian Kirchmeier. More details on that can also be seen on our website. Okay, so thank yous, keep popping in. And compliments as well. So once more, great job, Alberto. Thanks a lot. Thanks everyone.
Thanks so much, Florian, and thanks everybody.
Great for participating. And yeah, please make sure to join us again and to check out the website for recordings of this lecture, of last week's lecture, and of course in the future also of the upcoming lectures. So goodbye, everyone. Have a good lunch. Don't think of Jonathan Swift's suggestions for lunch too much when you're having lunch. And yeah, absolutely. Thanks to you guys, and see you very soon. Goodbye.